Challengers is a 2024 sports, romance, drama type of deal, directed by Luca Guadagnino of Call Me By Your Name and Suspiria remake fame. This is an instant favorite of mine. I saw it twice this week. I would probably like to see it again while it's in theaters one more time. And, there's a number of factors I think that go into it, but the one that interested me the most was the score usage. And it's certainly attention grabbing. It has, it's certainly been asked several times I've seen on the internet. And so I think that's just interesting to dive into in terms of the way movies are constructed and the way score can be used in a slightly unique way to provide, in this case, some thematic tie-ins and unify things, even things that are just visual within the movie. So the score in the film is present in many scenes. It is not sort of background music. It is normally mixed pretty loud, especially the electronic music, often to the same volume approximately as the dialogue. There's some non-electronic score as well, which we'll get into, because I think that plays an important role as well. It seems to me like the most noteworthy, or the most eye-catching part of the film, or at least the part of the film score, is that loud electronic music, which often comes in scenes which you wouldn't expect, fairly mundane scenes. So I want to get into a little bit what I think the purpose is, and how it serves to boost the film as a whole. Kind of felt like I was even more disorganized than usual in this video, so I just kind of wanted to record this real quick as a summary, and then if you want to go on and watch my semi-coherent rambling, then please do. But basically, this is the gist of it. The electronic music is very consistently associated with like a sort of unhealthy interpersonal dynamic. Usually it's kind of trying to win the relationship or to beat out friends or significant others in the process of the relationship or conflict or just sometimes competition. There's also the non-electronic score, which is frequently associated with what I might call a certain purity or human honesty. Zendaya has a couple of moments of hers that have the choir music or the piano score associated with her making, philosophical statements about, the tennis as it relates to life, or us watching her struggle through the emotions with her injury and her loss of her primary goal, or her raw honesty in kind of going to Pat and sleeping with him out of like finally confronting her own internal desires and emotions. So, like I said, there are generally two camps of music in the film. There's electronic, non-electronic. Neither one of them has like a one specific theme that it subscribes to, but there is a pretty clear divide between the two, except for in one scene, which I'll try to remember to cover. It's not in my notes, but I'll try to remember. The non-electronic music starts from the very beginning. That's actually the first piece of score we get. The film opens with, by the way, spoilers. I'm pretty sure I'm going to put it in the thumbnail, but spoilers. The very first scene of the film is, well, first it's the kind of sweaty faces, the exertion of a tennis match. And then it jumps into this choir-driven piece, which we see pop up in a couple of other locations as well. It's one of the staples of the non-electronic music. But that's the first thing we get. That will also pop up when Tashi is underneath the tree crying kind of about her injury after she had the second sort of scare, when she's trying to push herself. And additionally, when Tashi and Pat are, making out at the car in the windstorm. Another part of the non-electronic score is the sort of piano piece, which will be playing in the background of the beach scene. And I believe after Tashi and Pat talk about coaching behind the hotel. And I believe there's one more time, but I either couldn't find it in my notes or I forgot to write it down. But pops up a few times. And then there's also the Spanish-flavored song for when Art and Tashi are kind of having their potential breakup scene. The electronic music has a few more songs than that. The most heavily featured one is the theme titled Challengers, which is I love that song. Every time that song comes in the movie, it's just like it just gets me going instantly. I love it. But that type of music, the electronic stuff, plays primarily during tennis scenes, as well as different scenes of arguments. Like I have a few written down here, like Like when Tashi and Art have their initial sort of introductory power scuffle at the hotel, when Tashi and Pat have an argument, when Tashi and Pat have an argument, and Tashi and Pat are cheating in Atlanta, as well as Art kind of verbally beating down Pat in the sauna. So in order to kind of give a good foundation for what these styles of music represent to the film, it's a good idea to go back to the beginning, find where they're established, and see if there is a pattern in the way they're used. But you would normally go back to the origin, and I'm sure you could give counterexamples to this, but I would default to searching for where they're established, and does that meaning carry through? So let's think about where these two different camps of music start out. The non-electronic music, as I pointed out, the very first piece is the choir stuff right after we get just this first quick glimpse of the sweat-soaked faces playing tennis. This is not quite enough context yet to determine what this means, so we'll jump to the second one. Although I think after the movie is done, it's clearer to me, from the beginning scene what that music entails. So the second scene of non-electronic music is out on the beach, where we have that piano piece kind of playing in the background as they kind of talk about Tashi's career, about how the boys are perhaps not as serious as she is. And the main piece of this scene, the main feature, is when Tashi is talking about, or comparing life to tennis, saying they mirror each other, saying that, in the middle of a match, it's almost like being in love. It's like everything about that person. So to me, that is a great reference point for that type of score's purpose, because the subsequent usages of that score are very genuine moments. So, for instance, the film seems to very much respect tennis as a sport, with the way it's shot, with the intensity it's given. Tennis is not a joke in the movie. It has gravity. It has intensity. It is a main feature of the film that is respected. And I believe that what Tashi is saying there is a genuine statement expressing admiration for the sport that the film believes in. When Tashi, I keep trying to say Zendaya, I guess I could say either, it doesn't matter. But when Tashi is sitting under the tree post-injury, there is clearly like a genuine nature to what she's experiencing right there. It's been built up the whole movie, basically, that like this is what matters to her. And it's certainly emphasized after as well, but throughout the movie, it's either she needs to succeed, she needs to dominate in any area of her life, really. But we can especially see, even before that moment, her interactions with Art inform that the lack of tennis in her life, the lack of success in that regard, needs to be replaced with something. There is a very genuine nature to her loss and her emotion on her face in that scene. Because we don't get a whole lot of clarity into her character. She spends a lot of the movie kind of projecting what she wants to project. Pat ultimately calls her out in the car on this, emphasizing that he may be terrible, but he's willing to admit it. Tashi, on the other hand, professes not to be a homewrecker, but kind of enjoys doing homewrecking, for instance. She also kind of professes that Art can do whatever he wants, but at the same time, she is basically the driving force driving him along. She is, kind of the proverbial, parent living vicariously through, or, the spouse living vicariously through Art's accomplishments. So, throughout, she's kind of professing to be these various things, not necessarily representing them. But we have some of these score moments associated with her. This one right here, genuine emotion, genuine loss for something that was basically her entire drive, her entire life. The choir music in the background really hits that home. It's as genuine as the movie's statement on tennis, on its kind of philosophical and artistic merits. Another one is after Pat proposes that she be his coach behind the hotel. And that scene specifically, actually, I should have saved this one for last, but I'll just hit it right now. That one I think is especially interesting because the score isn't just the piano. The piano actually mixes with the electronic music right there, which I think gives a great feeling of kind of both of these ideas coming together. Does she need to continue playing basically the power plays? the play for dominance, the play for victory that the electronic music is associated to. So the electronic music, we can see that come into play during the first tennis match. Now, like I said, very first piece of score, choir, nice, genuine. That's what that's associated with. But it's not very long into the first tennis match where we kind of get the visual implications of our triangle. So there's a simple, genuine depiction of tennis, albeit very brief, and not just tennis, but really something sexual as well, given the, all of the imagery regarding like sweat and exertion and the human body is certainly like an association with sex that's present throughout the film. So given that we also have that association visually, alongside Tashi's kind of proclamation that tennis mirrors life, love, knowing someone completely, that first scene kind of has this feeling of representing good, joyous human experiences in general. Like, obviously tennis is the conduit, but it is expanded upon to be life in general. So we kind of have this pure, genuine expression of joy at the very beginning of the movie. Then we get these associations with jealousy, with competition, with, sort of tainting the genuineness and the joy of what we initially start out with and what we eventually close with. The electronic music is kind of like dark, pumping energy. It's the fuel of competition. It's the fuel of, or it's the feeling of trying to exert dominance. It's something that pops up not just in tennis, not just to be exhilarating on the court, but it's also frequently coming up in arguments, in discussions, in interpersonal conflict. Because so much of the conflict in the film is driven by the desire to, quote unquote, win at the relationship. And not just the relationship, sometimes life. Tashi is driven exclusively to succeed, to dominate. And like in that scene in bed with Pat, that doesn't stop when she's off the court. That mentality is with her all the time. And I do think it's kind of interesting, just to side tour off the soundtrack again. There is a little bit of emphasis, like enough to be clear that it's a point, placed on Tashi's background, given that she's to some degree lower economic status. It's unclear exactly where, but she was not able to afford boarding school, and perhaps that disadvantage is what provides that drive. Perhaps growing up in a sport like tennis, which is, I believe, traditionally fairly well off. Certainly the proceedings at tennis courts, as portrayed in the movie, feel pretty posh, pretty, what you might call high class, I suppose, given that, no inappropriate expressions of emotions or anything like that. Very, very clean and pristine presentation for that. Perhaps it's implied that, part of her drive just comes from feeling, inadequate or feeling out of place with the surroundings and just wanting to exert her dominance and prove that she is actually worthy of being in those spaces, something like that. I totally forget what I was talking about. I completely lost my train of thought. I wrote an outline for this, but I just completely went off script, so I can't really remember what I was at. But I think I was talking about the electronic music. So that shows up when the conflict shows up, basically. When the conflict is visually presented, we start getting the electronic music. It is then proliferated throughout as we continue to see these kinds of destructive conflicts. And then the brief moments of genuineness when people genuinely express something. We see Tashi genuinely expressing and feeling emotion. That's when the other type of score pops up. And I think it's absolutely vital, perhaps, that the score is as loud and sort of distracting in the electronic stuff as it is, even playing over conversations. Because that tension and that drive for domination and victory is just kind of overriding whatever is happening underneath it. That aggression and that, sort of unhealthy dynamic at play is going to, override anything good that might have been present underneath it, Just like once we start getting the clues as to the dynamic, genuine score is gone. The pumping music, the drive for competition and for victory in relationships takes over. So yeah, love the score. I mean, there's tons about the movie to talk about, I think, but like I already touched on some of the character stuff. I love the dynamic between Pat and Tashi. In a sense, they're the same but opposites. Like I mentioned earlier, the way that Pat is very transparent in a certain sense, the way that Tashi is very similar to him in a certain sort of way. As Pat emphasized, they're peers. They're still peers, even though she projects certain images that she's not necessarily following through on. I mostly just had notes about the score. I'll just bust open my notepad. Let's see if anything else sticks out to me right now. I do like how there's nice visual attention paid to Pat and Art kind of, being very in sync at certain moments, even after their friendship had ended and they reunite at the challenge event. There are still certain scenes that kind of paint them doing very symmetrical movements when they're off to the side. There's one section where we cut back to the present match, and the edits kind of cut their swings together, even on opposite sides, to kind of emphasize the fact that they never really stopped being quote-unquote right for each other, or stopped being able to be friends. There are lots of little visual touches that I thought were interesting. I mean, obviously the camera as a whole is very active. It moves a lot. The tennis, of course, is shot in a fascinating way. Especially, I think the end is awesome. The transition from like the first-person perspective of the ball is kind of wild, but then the way that transitions like and zooms out above into the top court view, the the bottom up view through like the glass floor looking almost like a tennis commercial or something like that is really interesting. The the very nerve-wracking cuts to them putting a ton of stress on their knees in that final fight, and you're just kind of living in fear, like, are we going to get a second like nasty knee injury? I could do without that little first person section. Personally, I thought that was kind of maybe a little bit too much. But in general, there's a lot of movement, a lot of chaos. Even this is something I would like to pay attention to on a third viewing. Even I get the feeling some of the dialogue scenes are shot with, it kind of felt like more cutting than usual. So I almost wonder if some of the dialogue scenes are meant to be a little more active, almost mirroring the tennis. But I could be imagining that. I don't want to put too much stock in that. The one scene that made me think of that was the scene talking about coaching in the back of the hotel, because it feels like there are 3 or 4 different angles of each of them that we kind of progress throughout the conversation. So I wonder if there's a similar thing throughout, because I feel like the movie cuts pretty actively, and I'm kind of wondering if that's to keep up with the pace of tennis, but could just be imagining that. I also like the little focus, I think, of Tashi and her lotion, which she seems to be constantly applying in, maybe like 4 or 5 times, whatever, something like that. I almost kind of wonder if that's a slight nod to her kind of trying to cover up her, or trying to project a certain image, where, she's kind of trying to present like this sort of polished softness, the coach's wife, who's being okay with, did I say the coach's wife? The tennis star's wife, and being okay with leaving tennis behind, but that's kind of something she needs to put on externally. In her natural state, she is concerned with the domination. She's concerned with winning, and the lotion, that sort of softness, is something that's applied externally, but it's not really true to herself. And the final section of the match is just so good. Like that tennis racket payoff is just one of the most satisfying things I've ever seen in a movie. That's incredible. The way Luca kind of teases out the resolution with, all the slow-mo, even the electronic song kind of stopping and starting a couple times, kind of denying that resolution. It's just so good, and it's so satisfying. It's so, like, I just got a huge smile on my face when I saw that happen. I was just like, you can see it kind of teasing a little bit because of the slow motion. Like, it's going to happen like 5 or 10 seconds earlier, and you're just waiting. You just love like the little smile on his face, the way it transforms the match, the emotion that comes out from Art, the way that it kind of transforms their game into something so much closer resembling the junior finals was. It's like harkening back to that before. Like, certainly the conflict over Tashi was present a little bit. It is certainly a different kind of conflict now. They are certainly not friends at this point, but it's like drawing them back to what used to be important. It's drawing them back to their adolescence when they were close, when that did matter. And then, ultimately it draws them together at the very last moment that, that embrace where, and I think that's really just like an awesome way to conclude that, with kind of bringing them back together through shared experiences, even if even if Pat's still a giant scumbag. But yeah, it's just such a beautiful, energetic, satisfying conclusion. I love it. Yeah, I love this movie. I want to watch it again, and I will continue listening to chunks of this score on Spotify. This movie's just so good.